And now the Deeper Thinking podcast, a daily exploration into how philosophy, psychology, and technology shape how we think, feel, and live.
Welcome to the Deeper Thinking podcast. This is an essay about limits, but not the kind that constrain us. It is about the limits that make freedom possible and the unseen architecture behind every act of knowing. At its surface, it explores Immanuel Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, one of the most difficult and consequential works in Western philosophy. But beneath that, it is an attempt to understand why the world appears the way it does and what it means to live with the knowledge that some things will always remain veiled. We build our sense of reality not from raw sensation, but from structures within the mind, space and time, cause and effect, necessity and unity. These are not learned, they are the conditions through which experience becomes possible. And yet, Kant reminds us, there is something behind this appearance that we will never grasp. The thing in itself, the noumenon. This unknowable reality is not a flaw in reason, but a feature. It is what prevents us from becoming mere mechanisms. It is what leaves room for freedom, for moral choice, for dignity. To critique reason, as Kant does, is not to diminish it. It is to preserve its role in the ethical life. If reason tries to prove everything, it collapses under its own weight. But when reason knows its limits, it can serve something higher. The capacity to act freely, to take responsibility, to live as moral beings in a world we cannot fully understand. This essay follows that arc from philosophical crisis through epistemological architecture to the fragile, luminous space where ethics begins. It is not just about Kant's ideas. It tries to write in the spirit of those ideas, precise, restrained, and attentive to what remains beyond our grasp. It does not promise certainty, but it holds open the possibility that there is something worth honouring on the far side of knowledge. A question trembles beneath every act of knowing. What if the mind doesn't merely receive the world, but secretly shapes it? This was the crisis Kant inherited, not from abstract speculation, but from David Hume's quiet devastation. Hume had shown that even our most fundamental beliefs, like causality or the continuity of objects, couldn't be proven by reason. We trust the future will resemble the past, but why should it? His skepticism didn't scream. It simply withdrew certainty. Kant called it the moment that woke him from his dogmatic slumber. And in that awakening, he did something few thinkers have done. He questioned the very scaffolding of knowledge itself. Kant's answer was not to refute skepticism, but to transcend its frame. What if the conditions that make experience possible are not drawn from the world, but from the mind? What if time and space are not features of reality, but of the lens through which we encounter it? This is Kant's Copernican turn. The world conforms to our perception, not the other way around. He called this transcendental idealism, and it quietly remade the coordinates of philosophy. Experience, he argued, is not raw data. It is structured, ordered, assembled, and the assembler is us. But Kant went further. If everything we know is shaped by this internal architecture, what happens to the world beyond it? Here, he drew a line as thin as breath and as absolute as death. The world as it appears to us, the phenomenal realm, is all we can ever know. The world as it is in itself, the noumenon, remains forever veiled. We do not see things as they are, but as they must appear within the conditions of our mind. And this isn't failure, it is necessity. For Kant, the tragedy of knowledge is not that it's incomplete, but that it always carries this ghost of absence. The real, the actual, unshaped, untouchable real withdraws just as reason approaches. But this withdrawal is not a closing. It is the price of freedom. If we understood the world as it is, wholly and mechanically, we would become part of its machinery. Instead, we are caught in the architecture of appearances. But within that architecture, we can think, act, choose. Reason, then, is not a mirror of the world. It is the condition for moral life within it. And that is not a compromise. It's a kind of dignity. There's a strange kind of courage in admitting we don't know. In the late 18th century, philosophy stood on the edge of collapse. The promise of reason, so long a pillar of certainty, was crumbling under its own ambition. David Hume had exposed its soft underside, showing that causality, identity, even the notion of self, might be illusions formed by habit. The ground beneath knowledge was no longer firm. Immanuel Kant felt the tremor deeply. Hume, he said, woke me from my dogmatic slumber. What followed was not a return to certainty, but the invention of a new kind of clarity, one built not on what we perceive, but on how we perceive. Kant's revolution began with a reversal. What if, he asked, it is not the world that shapes our understanding, but our understanding that shapes the world we experience? This was his Copernican turn. Just as Copernicus had displaced the Earth from the centre of the cosmos, Kant displaced the object from the centre of knowledge. The mind does not passively receive information from the world. Instead, it actively structures experience through a set of built-in forms, space and time being the first, most basic scaffolds. These are not discovered, they are imposed. Without them, there is no experience at all. This is where Kant introduces the notion of transcendental idealism. It sounds abstract, but it is deeply intimate. We never encounter the world as it is. We encounter only what the world becomes when filtered through the lens of human cognition. What we see, what we touch, what we believe, these are shaped by the structures of our own mind. There is the world as it appears to us, and then there is the world as it is in itself. Kant names this unreachable reality the noumenon. We can never access it, but we must believe it is there, veiled and silent, because without it, there would be no appearance at all. What begins as a philosophical adjustment soon becomes an existential dislocation. We are not epistemically sovereign. We are limited, necessarily so. Yet in that limitation lies a kind of strange freedom. If we cannot know the thing in itself, then we also cannot be ruled by illusions that pretend to grasp it. Reason is no longer omnipotent, but it is dignified, disciplined, awake. To critique reason is not to weaken it. It is to protect it from overreaching, to ensure that it serves human freedom rather than undermining it in pursuit of impossible knowledge. The culmination of Kant's project arrives in the domain where reason becomes most ambitious and most unstable: metaphysics. Here we ask not about objects of experience, but about the totality of existence. Is the world finite or infinite? Does the soul persist after death? Is there a necessary being or a god? These are not idle questions. They reflect the deepest impulses of human thought, the desire for absolute answers. And yet, Kant shows that reason, when it leaves the territory of experience, turns against itself. It produces arguments that are equally persuasive and mutually contradictory. He calls these the antinomies of pure reason. Each antinomy is a duel within reason itself. Take the question of the universe's beginning. Reason can argue that time must have had a starting point, an original moment beyond which nothing existed. But reason can also argue that time must be infinite, because every beginning presupposes a prior condition. Both arguments are logically valid, and both cannot be true. Reason, it turns out, is not equipped to answer questions it was never designed to pose. Kant's insight is not just intellectual, it is architectural. He has built a map of thought with borders, and he insists that real freedom lies in respecting them. This isn't a retreat, it's a rescue. By setting limits to knowledge, Kant safeguards the conditions for moral life. If reason could prove the existence of God, freedom, or the immortality of the soul, then these would be facts, not choices. They would be objects of knowledge, not matters of faith, intention, or ethical commitment. In limiting knowledge, Kant is carving out space for what he calls practical reason, the realm of action, responsibility, and autonomy. We cannot know the soul exists, but we must act as though it does. We cannot prove freedom, but we must presuppose it to be moral. This isn't contradiction, it's moral architecture. So the critique doesn't close with a grand answer, it closes with a profound realignment. Reason, once imagined as a conqueror of truth, becomes instead its custodian. The self, no longer imagined as transparent and rational, becomes a structured mystery, capable of acting in a world it can never fully know. And in that unknowability lies something irreducibly human. For Kant, the limits of knowledge are not flaws, they are the precondition for dignity. To act freely in a world partially veiled is not a failure of reason, it is its greatest expression. Kant's legacy does not lie in a doctrine, but in a transformation of what philosophy is allowed to be. He did not close the door on metaphysics, he changed the room it lives in. Before him, to be rational was to seek total explanation, an unbroken chain from cause to cause, culminating in certainty. After him, rationality became bounded, conditional, aware of its own scaffolding, and yet, in that restraint, a new kind of rigour appeared. Reason was no longer an instrument of domination, it became a framework for freedom, a self-limiting faculty that made room for moral will, political autonomy, and the dignity of the unknowable. Even today, the tension Kant exposed remains unresolved. In science, we continue to model the world with tools shaped by human cognition, often forgetting that these tools are not neutral. In politics, we speak of universal rights while struggling with the forms of perception that filter who is seen and who is not. In ethics, we wrestle with questions of freedom and responsibility that still lean on Kant's architecture. The scaffolding holds, even as it creaks under the weight of history and contradiction. But perhaps that is what Kant gave us most of all, a structure that admits its limits yet does not collapse under them. His work doesn't free us from paradox. It teaches us how to live inside it. We are beings caught between appearance and reality, reason and impulse, knowledge and mystery. And Kant's philosophy is not an escape from this condition. It is its most honest expression. To read the Critique of Pure Reason is to witness a mind building a house for thought, carefully measuring its dimensions, testing the strength of each beam, refusing ornament where the foundation is unsteady. It is a work of intellectual humility masquerading as systematic philosophy. And if it still stands, it is not because we agree with every part, but because we recognize the depth of its ethical ambition, to limit what can be claimed in order to protect what must be chosen. In a world seduced by certainty and threatened by its consequences, Kant offers a different posture. Not the grasping hand, but the open one. Not the eye that captures everything, but the one that sees its own lens. And in doing so, he reminds us that reason's highest calling may not be to master the world, but to honour the mystery that lets us live in it. There is a strange grace in the way Kant holds both ambition and restraint in the same breath. He builds one of the most elaborate systems in Western philosophy, pages dense with deduction, categories and diagrams, yet insists throughout that what matters most is not what we know, but how we come to know and what we must relinquish. He does not ask us to abandon reason, only to purify it, to stop mistaking its projections for reality. To see the architecture behind the appearance, to live in a world that is knowable enough to act within, but not so knowable that it collapses into totality. For totality, he warns, is a kind of death, the death of freedom, of mystery, of choice. And yet Kant is often misunderstood. He is called cold, abstract, mechanistic. But this is to miss the pulse beneath the prose. His philosophy is not sterile, it is protective. It protects the fragile gap between what is and what ought to be, between the way the world appears and the moral demands we place upon it. In that gap, morality is possible, autonomy is possible, even hope is possible. Kant does not offer transcendence in the traditional sense, no leap into the divine, no mystical intuition, but he offers something subtler and perhaps more enduring, a scaffolding for meaning that refuses illusion. That refusal is at its heart a moral gesture. For Kant, to lie about the world, to claim more than we can know, is not just an epistemic error, it is a kind of violence. It imposes form without condition. It removes the listener's freedom to judge. This, more than anything, is why reason must critique itself, not to diminish its power, but to use that power justly, to think without tyranny, to speak with precision, to believe without dogma. In this light, the Critique is not just a book of philosophy, it is an ethical text. A manual for intellectual honesty in an age of easy certainty. And so to read Kant now is not a return, it is an invitation to rebuild our thinking not as conquest but as care, to accept limits not as failures but as boundaries within which human life can unfold meaningfully. The veil may never lift, the real may never appear unfiltered, but behind the veil Kant shows us is not despair. It is the very condition that allows us to live, to choose, to be responsible for the world we help to shape. And perhaps that is the quiet, enduring brilliance of the Critique of Pure Reason. It does not ask us to abandon the dream of understanding, only to wake within it. Kant does not say that knowledge is impossible. He says that knowledge has a form, a shape given by the human mind. And that shape is not arbitrary. It is universal, stable, necessary. It allows science to progress, morality to be reasoned, and freedom to be preserved. But it also means that some questions will always remain open, that certain truths, no matter how deeply we yearn for them, will resist capture, not because we lack intellect, but because we are not built to know everything. This is not a humiliation, it is a humanization. The mind, for Kant, is not a godlike observer. It is a finite structure with extraordinary power, and with that power comes responsibility, to know where thought must pause, to resist the temptation of metaphysical overreach, to honour the distinction between what can be understood and what must be imagined. In this distinction, Kant finds the space for ethics, for law, for a republic of reason grounded not in revelation, but in shared limitation. That is the final paradox. Kant's restrictions on knowledge do not constrain our moral world. They enable it. By bracketing the absolute, he opens the path to autonomy. By denying speculative certainty, he clears a space where freedom can matter. In the silence beyond the antinomies, in the space between phenomenon and noumenon, we are not abandoned, we are entrusted. To act not because we know the outcome, but because we must choose the right thing, even in the face of what we cannot know. In this way, Kant's critique becomes more than a philosophical intervention. It becomes a stance, a way of being in the world. To live as if truth matters, while knowing we may never possess it. To act with moral seriousness, even when metaphysical clarity fails. To preserve the dignity of reason, not by extending it into every crevice of the cosmos, but by protecting it from itself. So we live inside the frame Kant gave us, aware that what we see is never the whole, that our knowledge comes shaped by forms we did not choose, and that in that shaping there is both limitation and liberation. The veil remains, but so does the light behind it. Until next time.
You've been listening to the Deeper Thinking podcast. Today's episode was narrated by Holly, our digital narrator, who helps bring our ideas to life. Thank you for your positive reviews on Apple Podcasts. Your reviews help keep us visible so others can discover and enjoy our content.